I think my sister's gonna flip the slides for me. I did mine, as she said, on I started off looking at international sex trafficking, but I morphed into domestic sex trafficking. 6 years ago, I got interested in trafficking when a girl from my hometown, Sarah, was found dead and bloody on the railroad tracks. I wanted to know what happened to her, why it happened, and most importantly, why no one did anything about it. I started looking through books and reading articles and watching documentaries about trafficking victims. I wanted to understand how the girls became victims, who bought them, why they bought them, in what countries, and where specifically in the U.S. The United States Department of Health and Human Services defines sex trafficking as a modern-day form of slavery in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act is under the age of 18 years. The U.S. State Department estimates each year between 600,000 to 800,000 women are subject to international human trafficking. The State Department also estimates that as many as 17,500 slaves are brought into the United States every year from many different countries, and it's likely that trafficking within the United States involves several times as many. Trafficking victims are predominantly made up of women and children. About 80% are female, about 50% below the age of 18. They come from all different races and socioeconomic backgrounds. And trafficked persons do not have to be people that have crossed international lines or borders. American youth are actually the most vulnerable to becoming victims of sex trafficking in our own country. Trafficking is intertwined in the sex industry, but traffickers and pimps know how to disguise it. One article states, one issue is the lack of regulation within the U.S. sex industry. While prostitution is illegal, except in the state of Nevada, the sale of pornography, aside from child pornography, and strip clubs are illegal but highly unregulated. Strip clubs, which are usually zoned in certain areas, are often used as a front for prostitution. One study estimated 70% of women in the sex industry became involved before their 18th birthday. And if you remember from the definition I gave earlier, that means that on average, according to that article, about 70% of women in the sex industry were at one point trafficked. In addition, traffickers and pimps often maintain legitimate businesses, and they have gas stations, beauty salons, limousine services. They run travel agencies, real estate agencies. They're farmers. And they also have these the strip clubs to cover up unlawful activities. In addition, traffickers market their quote-unquote talent through a variety of seemingly legitimate organizations. And usually they market them through bars or clubs or massage parlors, modeling services, and entertainment for bachelor parties. Anywhere between $5 to $500, a trafficked person can be bought for 1 hour. The youngest trafficking victim I read about was 2 weeks old, and the oldest was in her 90s. I also realized throughout the whole research process that there really aren't a lot of quantitative studies on trafficking because it's such a secretive, behind closed doors type of industry. So this summer, when I began doing my research, I wanted to look at quantifying trafficking, and specifically I was looking at quantifying internet sex trafficking. I was going to do this by linking up court cases with site users. And throughout that whole thing, I was contacting anti-trafficking organizations to see if they could point me in the direction of resources that would provide information about these court cases. And when I came to the conclusion that there really aren't enough court cases to create a conclusive database, my focus on quantifying it shifted a little bit. And so I started looking at anti-trafficking organizations, and I ended up creating a database of over 2,700 anti-trafficking organizations. A comprehensive list of this information isn't available online. Okay, so this just shows a strip of, a snip of part of the anti-trafficking database that I created. And as you can tell, I have the name in like the left column, and then I start with the address, and I've got the state and some of the additional contact information in there. And let's see, from there I looked specifically at anti-trafficking organizations per state and linked that up with a data set of strip clubs to run analysis. So, and this is kind of the way that I went about creating the database of, there already was an online database of strip clubs, and I just needed to compile it into a readable format. So this is kind of how I did it. And then from there I separated it into Excel, in an Excel sheet, and without getting too much into it, then I just looked at the state that the strip clubs were in and compared that to the state that the anti-trafficking organizations were in. So I created the next data set, which should be the next slide. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so in the left column, you've got the state, and then the first column's the clubs, the second column's the anti-trafficking organization, and then those other columns are just additional variables that I looked at. So I looked at the number of strip clubs because, as I alluded to earlier, many of the victims of trafficking are presumed to have entered the sex industry voluntarily. According to CIA estimates, each year approximately 50,000 women and children are trafficked for commercial sexual exploitation in the form of prostitution, sex shows, pornography, and stripping. One club owner is quoted as saying it's the prostitution, not the stripping, that brings in the money. He was specifically referring to a strip club. So from the data that we've got up here, I found that California had the most anti-trafficking organizations at 295, followed by Texas with 151, and Minnesota with 123. Delaware had the fewest number of anti-trafficking organizations with 6, and then Nebraska with 7. Looking at the database of strip clubs, I found that Texas had the most with 182, followed by California with 177, and New York with 138. Then what I did was I used some statistical analysis tests, and this is an output from one of those. Basically what it tells us is that as the number of strip clubs in a state go up, the number of anti-trafficking organizations in the state will also go up. And then the other variables that I included, just for background, if you're interested, I looked at the number of churches per state and then the number of church memberships per state. As total churches increased per state, the number of anti-trafficking organizations also increased. But as total church membership increased for a state, the number of anti-trafficking organizations decreased. A literature review of articles, books, documentaries, and online resources, as well as a more detailed analysis of variables and findings, has become the topic of my senior thesis paper. Using the anti-trafficking database that I compiled, I created an interactive map and a website that I'm editing to make more user-friendly. This is a screenshot of the website. The website will include the interactive map, as you can see, as well as contact information for anti-trafficking sites, addresses, phone numbers, fax numbers, PO box numbers, email addresses, websites, and hotline numbers, as well as descriptions of organizations. Trafficking exists as a problem throughout the world. It's a problem in the U.S., in my hometown, and even in Omaha. In preparation for the College World Series, anti-trafficking organizations and scholars estimated dozens of girls were being trafficked into Omaha. Last night, as I was preparing for my presentation, I went online and found 9 potential sex trafficking ads here in Omaha. I began my research on trafficking because I wanted to become informed about the issue. I wanted to understand why and how it happened to Sarah in my hometown, and I wanted to do something about it. In addition to the academic benefits of collecting data on sex trafficking, once I publish my database, it can be used as a resource for anti-trafficking organizations, advocates, and trafficking victims themselves. I believe that as more people become aware of trafficking's effects in the U.S. and in their community, there will be beneficial social and political changes that could reduce the number of stories like Sarah. And I'd be happy to, and I need to do some thank yous. I want to thank Dr. Moreno, who was my research advisor. I also want to thank Dr. Holly Ann Harris and the School of Arts and Sciences, as well as Dr. Ramsden, Dr. Wunsch, and Dr. Hendrickson in the Political Science Department, as well as Ms. Jolene and the Political Science Department as a whole. And in addition to family and friends and Dr. Keegan, who I think snuck out, for their support. So thank you. And